Thank you. Great pleasure. Everything's relative, I guess. We're gonna have some fun today, people. Of course, if you've seen sort of the movie Harold and Maude, you would know that everybody has their own perverse sense of what might be fun. This is episode number one of Board of Directors Boot Camp 2025. The name of the episode is Roles and Responsibilities, a Primer. Our panelists today are Alan Grafman of All Media Ventures, Alex Sharp of Sharp Consulting, and David Spitolnik of Spitolnik Advisors. My name is Jonathan Friedland. I'm with Cellist. The producers for this webinar are Financial Poise. You can see more about Financial Poise on slide 66. And the National Law Review, you can see more about the National Law Review on slide 65. Our names you can see on slide 5 if you just want to see our names, but you can also see our names starting on slides 53 through 56. You don't get little 30, 60, or even more annoyingly 90-second bios on a Financial Poise webinar. We know you're not here for infomercials. If you like what we have to say or are impressed by what we have to say, you can always reach out to us because our information is in our bios. We hope you have a good time. With respect to the slides, and I've got just a couple of other housekeeping items, and then we can jump right to the substantive agenda. I'll try to call your attention to slides that are relevant to whatever question I may ask, and thus to whatever we're talking about. And if you're listening but not watching, I'll call those out in two ways. I'll call the number out, but I'll also turn to the slide if I can, chew gum and walk at the same time. I'll try to do that as much as I can. But the slides are not critical. This is a conversation between the panelists and me. I pretend that I'm a non-expert. Maybe I'm a company owner. Maybe I'm a newbie would-be director. Maybe I'm a junior lawyer, and someone gave me, in my case, a Hanukkah present of an hour free consult with 3 experts. And I prepared for it by creating a list of questions. They haven't seen the list, but I'm prepared to ask some questions that I think are all right. Now, slide 10, and again, I'm turning to it, is not the slide reference. Slide 4. Slide 4 is the disclaimer. None of us are your advisors, your lawyers, your accountants. You're not our clients. This is general education. You'd be foolish to act on anything we say or don't say without getting proper advice that you actually pay hourly for. That said, without further ado, I'm ready to ask my questions. So, Alex, you're on alert. The first question is going to be to you. Audience, I'm not gonna ask questions about slide 6, which is currently on the slide, or on your screen, or slide 7. These are more sort of level setting informational slides about what we about what this webinar is about and why we think it's important. That said, the first set of slides we'll talk about, the question audience relates to slides 10 and 11 and 14 through 18. Alex, you're going to start us off with the very basics in terms of what a board is and what the legal responsibilities of a board are. Tell us a little bit about that.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. So first of all, there's 2 broad categories of boards, right? You basically have fiduciary boards, and then you have boards for nonprofits. But we won't distinguish amongst the 2 maybe until a little further in, but just understand that there are some differences for whether you're publicly traded, you're privately held, or you're a nonprofit board. And just keep that in the back of your mind. And Jonathan found a slide talking about that. That's perfect timing. But back to what is a board? A board is elected by the shareholders to represent their interests. It's actually that simple. The board represents the shareholders' interests. Now, depending on the type of board, it depends on what the shareholders are, right? A publicly traded company means you actually own stock. If you're privately held, that means you could be a family member, like a founder. It can also mean that you're an investor, right? So what that means really changes. But at the end of the day, the key thing is boards are elected by shareholders to represent their interests. And that's the bottom line. Now, with that said, you have this other thing called an officer. An officer is elected, excuse me, is hired by the board, but not elected by the shareholders to actually run the company day in and day out. And then you have the rest of the people in the world called employees, which are hired by effectively the officers to do the day-to-day work. Three basic categories. Now, in terms of board structure, it all really comes down to effectively two things. It comes down to your organizational documents, like predominantly your bylaws, charter, articles of incorporation, the things that make the organization what it is, and the laws that you need to abide by. And you'll probably get into that a little more, but that really sets the structure and the composition of the board. In
Right.
terms of,
Well, let me ask you to pause just for a second. And before you continue, let me invite the other panelists to overlay on anything that they heard or anything else they think is highly relevant to what they
sure,
heard. Guys, anything?
I'm sure Alex is going to talk about duty of care,
out to go there.
which is up next.
So let's hold off on duty of care. Um, is there anything else you want to bring up though? No? Okay, now go, Alex.
All right. So we talked about duty of care. There's basically three, depending on how you count, three or four duties. It comes down to duty of care, duty of loyalty, duty of obedience. And duty of care basically means you're entrusted with running the company on behalf of the shareholders. So you have to act like an owner. Um, you need to work on an informed basis, which means you're making informed decisions and you have to act in the company's best interest. That's duty of care in the essence. Duty of loyalty means just that, right? You're loyal to the company, you follow its bylaws, you have undivided interests, which means you can't, we can get into it a little bit, but you can't really serve two masters. So if you can't really sit on the board of two competing companies, for example. Duty of obedience means you follow the governing documents, right? And those are the three basic duties. There's tons of information written about this. There's a lot of nuances. The attorneys on the panel are in a far better position to talk through the intricacies of it, but that's the broad strokes.
If one were to Google, basic fiduciary duties, some articles and other materials they would find would say there's two duties, duty of care, duty of loyalty. Others would list out half a dozen or a dozen.
Yep.
And there's sort of schools of thought in the best way to think about it. I happen to be part of the school that says, look, there's two basic duties, loyalty and care, and all of the other so-called duties, including that of obedience, are sort of subsets. But should you not have anything better to do and start to Google like that, you'll see that there's a number of ways to skin the cat. Let me move us on to my next question, unless anyone wants to overlay on what Alex said specifically.
Nope.
Okay. So, Alan, the next question is for you, an audience. I've now turned to slide 13. Now that we understand what a board is and its critical role in corporate governance, we don't really understand, but at least we talked about it. Let's talk about how private companies form and evolve their board structures.
So there's a couple thoughts here from 30,000 feet. For those who are preparing to go on a board or wish to go on a board, your point of entry is much more likely at an independent private company or an advisory. And that's something that is, it's a great entry point. And so I'm going to speak to how that's a little bit different than what Alex spoke to. So advisory boards are often set up for slightly different purposes. In fact, one can say the purposes overlap, but they are different. And let me give some examples. Advisory boards do not have fiduciary duty, and they are generally, I'm going to say, privately driven. You don't see, they're much more important for private companies. They're important for venture capital types of companies. And I often advocate for venture capital types of companies, emerging growth types of companies. It's a great way for the company to access talent without burdening them with fiduciary duties, which have a legal. So venture capital, you'll also often see advisory boards. You'll see them also for as family-controlled companies, private companies. Advisory directors often have observer rights. They often have rights to participate in purchasing shares. And that's not exclusive to independent or private companies. And generally, they meet quarterly, and generally they're friendly. They're friendly because at any time, someone on an advisory board, generally speaking, can step down. Generally, they not encumbered with supervising the company. They're friendly. They support. They may be able to access different investors or different relationships. So for private companies or for companies that are family run, an advisory board is a great resource, and its requirements overlap but are different than a fiduciary board of a public company.
Just one thing to add into there is that there are some cases where, and again, it's the advisory board, even in the advisory board, it's the breadth of what you're doing, because some advisory boards also have, have a formal charter. Others are just a group of people who the CEO or whatever will call in to help on a periodic basis to help him help his leadership think about specific issues. So you've got a full spectrum of the kinds of things that they are being called on to do.
Thank you. Any other overlay? Okay. David, please talk to us, audience. I'm turning our back to slide 12. Please talk to us about some of the key differences between a fiduciary board of directors in the context of a privately owned company versus that of a publicly owned company.
Well, when you're talking about a fiduciary board, and again, this goes back to the fiduciary versus advisory also. A fiduciary board does have specific responsibilities, and those responsibilities need to be spelled out, because you are giving when you create a fiduciary board, typically you are giving them specific responsibilities. And there's a whole discussion that we won't necessarily get into here about director and officer liability insurance, but it goes back to what is it that you have responsibility to do. And so the fiduciary board, and I'm sorry, John, the question was fiduciary board for a private company versus fiduciary board for a public company?
Yes, we've moved on. We're not going to talk about mere
Okay.
advisory boards anymore. Now we're talking
Okay.
about board of directors, private
Okay.
versus public.
So the public board is typically elected by the shareholders. The public board helps to make sure that all financials are disclosed. Typically, in a public company, the fiduciary board does have responsibility for hiring and firing of the CEO. And then there's the whole question of compliance. And again, the lawyers in the room can talk about Sarbanes-Oxley, but there's a whole set of compliance issues that the public companies have. The private company, again, even if it's a fiduciary board, it still is dependent. Their responsibilities are dependent on what's in the bylaws and what's in the charter for the board. So, for example, a fiduciary board for a private company may not be responsible for hiring the CEO, because either the major shareholders will do that. In the case what was discussed a little while ago, if it's a venture firm or a family, the family may say, well, so-and-so is the CEO, or if it's a significantly, the ownership is concentrated in one small group. They may say, here's the CEO. Another part of the story is with the fiduciary board, with the private company, are these people independent directors or are they members of the family? And so again, the independent directors, fine, maybe they own a little bit of stock as opposed to being members of the family. There's a whole realm of things that there's a whole realm of issues. And then the last point that I would make is just if it's a private company, are they there? It's a fiduciary board within the charter, within the bylaws, are they there? Who are they representing? Who are the board members representing? Are they representing the majority of shareholders? Are they representing some of the minority shareholders, any of them? And are they representing family members? So all of those kinds of things come into the discussion of, what are the roles and responsibilities of the directors into the being a fiduciary director of a private company.
Just to overlay for a moment, the way I always explain it is that for the most part, private company directors and public company directors have more in common with each other than they have not in common. The basic fiduciary duties are the same: duty of loyalty, duty of care. The basic the business judgment rule applies in both contexts. The major differences, which you, David, hit on, and I just want to put even a finer point on it, is number one, a public company, each board member represents the shareholders as a whole typically, whereas the freedom of contract enables in a private company setting, you often see in business arrangements that, these shareholders will appoint this director, these shareholders will appoint that director. As a legal matter, they have duties to all shareholders, but in practice, you're there to look out for the interest of, you can't ignore the fact that who appointed you effectively. And the other major difference is, as David touched on, is the regulatory overlay, right? The securities laws of the federal securities laws and the securities laws of the 50 states each impose a set of duties on companies and thus their boards that in the public company context that simply don't exist in the private company context. Anyone else want to overlay at all?
No.
Going once, going twice.
I guess, John, the only other thing, and I made this comment and I will probably say it 5 or 6 times during the course of the discussion, is the whole notion of, as a board member, what your liability is. And so this whole thing where each one, and I realize that discussion comes up more when you're talking about fiduciary versus advisory boards, but the concept that there's a concept that has been drummed into my head over the years, which is the concept of implied authority. Whether or not you have authority, there are many who think, if you say something to the CEO and the CEO goes out and acts on it, even though you didn't have the right to tell him to do that, the implied authority is he did it because you told him to do that. And therefore, you get into the whole question of whether the insurance will cover you for those things. And that's a question not necessarily for today, but it's one that people really need to keep in mind as they're thinking about their board service.
Thank you. Any other overlay, guys?
Yeah, let me dive in. What David brings up is incredibly important on so many levels, because we talk about duties. So, for example, board members, the courts have ruled that board members have a duty of providing for the safety and security of the employee, right? So incidents can happen totally out of left field. Being somebody who spends a lot of time with emerging technology, we have areas around like cybersecurity, privacy, and now AI with the folks that traditionally work in that space were really technologists doing technology things. And now as the technology has become a business conversation, who's responsible, the level of awareness the board has to have, the actions that are taken, it's changing the game, right? And there's a lot of questions about who should be given insurance, what kind of legal agreements exist within the company? Should we change the board mixture to be able to make more informed decisions? We're in an interesting time around that liability. Things are moving. And this conversation, for the longest time, I would say was coming up twice a week. Now it's probably coming up twice a month, but it's definitely on everybody's mind.
Thank you. Any other overlay before I move us on? All right. In the background, by the way, you'll notice I'm displaying some slides that don't relate to the specific topic at hand. The subject of my questions and these guys' answers, which I'll continue to do until another relevant slide comes up. Not all of my questions have a tie-in to a slide. So let's talk a little bit about a board in practice, a board in action. And it's often said that boards have three primary objectives. And kind of like I said before, this is just one way to articulate it. Another reasonable lawyer or expert in the area might say it differently. But the way I think of it is it's hiring and firing the CEO, which we talked a little bit about. It's being involved in corporate strategy, and it's oversight of risk management. Now we've already talked a little bit about the hiring of a CEO. We didn't talk about the firing of a CEO. Alan, talk to us to the extent that you want to talk about those things, but also certainly talk about some examples of how a board of directors can add value for a CEO.
So in an ideal world, boards materially contribute to the success of the CEO and the company. And going forward, I'm going to speak as if they're the same. So I'll speak about how boards can assist the CEO. So in an ideal world, there is a chairman or a weaker variant, a lead director. That's a focal point for communication. And communication between the board and the CEO is I'm doing this. I'll stop doing that. A board can contribute very directly to the success of the CEO to the extent that they have an open line of communication, to the extent that I'll say the chairman has not only an open line of communication, but the respect and ideally different capabilities, different experiences, and ideally more experience and more relationships and more wisdom so that the CEO seeks it out. They can be helpful during crisis management. They can be helpful in developing new relationships. They can be helpful in being able to smooth out, I'll say, disturbances or bubbles that come up from the committees. In short, a board should be accretive. And having said all that, they have to be sensitive to the fact that it's often said on the day of a board meeting, the CEO is the happiest when he sees the taillights of the board of directors leaving the premises. So if a director is sensitive to that, they will be accretive, they will be attributing value, they will not be excessively intruding into the business of the company, but are there to lend guidance and expertise.
Great. Overlay, guys. So next item on that list of a 3-item list was strategic contributions to the company overall. Alex, without stepping on the same ground Alan stepped on, how would you summarize what a board should be doing to contribute strategically to the company as a whole?
You're mute.
Oh, sorry about that. Thank you. So some of that depends on the effectiveness and the dynamics of the board and the relationship with the CEO, like Alan pointed out. But in general, you hire board members for reasons: expertise, diversity of thought, contacts, capabilities, all the things we think of. What I think that we often lose sight of is the board itself is much more strategic. They're not supposed to get stuck in the weeds. So a lot of times where I see the value is because they are looking a little further down the road. They have a different level of abstraction. They can also play the role of rock throwers, professional rock throwers, right? So the CEO can come in and talk about the strategy and all, and have discussions where he's got his peers and his friendlies that will pick it apart and start to ask the different questions. A lot of times with strategy, strategy effectively has two sides to it, right? It's got the value creation, but then you also have the risk management side, because you can't create value without managing risk. So the board can be a very effective tool for that. They can also be a very effective tool for managing the process and for keeping the shareholders' interests at heart. It's very easy for the officers of a company, the management, the employees to think about the next quarter. You want your board to be looking multiple years out. The board also funds and allocates resources. So another way they can help is actually looking at resource allocation in terms of time, energy, people, dollars, to actually realize a strategy and kind of map out, fine, you want to do that strategy, here's what we're going to have to give up, right? And it's hard to get that from management. It really is, because they have a different set of influences and a different perspective.
Thank you.
I would just, Jonathan, I would only emphasize for everyone this notion of looking out beyond that Alex just said. I think that is, for me, asking the questions of, have you thought about, or what do you think about? And not doing that, to say you're not intelligent. It's doing that to say, look, here's something out in left field or out in another universe that we may want to think about. And I've seen examples where, the company and the people, the management looks at you like you are from another planet when you ask that question. And then in a little while it comes back and says, we hadn't thought about that before. And as we think about it and we put it more into our own words, perhaps there's something there that will take us out beyond whatever our normal, wherever we are. And so that looking out over the horizon, yeah, the management's supposed to do that. The CEO is supposed to do that. But the board has more flexibility and more capability often to do that than does the CEO and the existing management.
Thank you. Any other overlay? Okay. The next question will be for Alan. And we're going to turn to slide 14 in a moment. Alan, oversight of risks. What are some of the types of risks that a board should be on guard against and looking out for and trying to manage down to zero as close to possible?
So there's no end of risks that can impact performance. And again, a board's primary purpose is to assist the CEO and the company succeed. So the risks can come from innumerable sources. There's strategic risk, there is operational risk, there's crisis risk, there's leadership risk, there's cultural risk, there's safety risk, there's cyber risk. There's no end of the different types of risks. A board needs to calibrate where they put their I'll say their focus. Strategic is arguably uh, preeminent, along with hiring and firing the CEO, because that is something only the board has been enumerated to be responsible for. The CEO and the company shares all those other risks that I enumerated. They're responsible. It's only when it becomes a problem that it usually bubbles up to the board. So a crisis. I'm an advocate when there's a huge crisis. The board should step forward, a designated member of the board should step forward with the CEO, let's say, so investors know the CEO, it was on his watch that this problem came up. Not only is the CEO addressing it, but we know the board's involved. Culture is one that often bubbles up. Audit and financial and whistleblower and reporting often bubble up through the audit committee. So in short, the risk that is a preeminent risk for the board, again, is strategy. All the other risks that I've just mentioned, I would say begin with the operations, but at a certain point, they can bubble up to the board and need to be assessed and possibly addressed.
Thank you. Guys, who wants to overlay on what Alan had to say? Anyone? Anyone?
Jonathan, I'll jump in. Risk management as a general practice is something that I can't help myself from speak about, because you can't create value without managing risk. You just can't. There's no way around it. I think Alan did a fantastic job. There's over 100 risks if you look to the different frameworks that have to be managed. Very important stuff. But we also the board needs to do a couple of other things. First of all, they need to look at how we're going to treat that risk. What risk is acceptable? What kind of risks do we want to avoid? Maybe by changing our strategy or changing our tactics. What are we going to mitigate? What are we going to choose to transfer, most commonly done through insurance? So they also have to look at how they're willing to treat it. And probably the most important piece in the risk area is determining the risk appetite for the organization. What is the organization willing to accept? And then communicate that tone throughout the organization. You want the tone at the top to align with the risks, with the resources in the ranks. So there's a lot of pieces when it comes to risk that are very important to consider. And to Alan's point, it cannot be fluffed off. This is the kind of stuff that will kill you. Something will go wrong, and at that point, you just have to stand up and develop some confidence and get through it and learn from it.
Anything else, guys? I'll overlay with just one thought. Something that's very much in the news today. I don't mean today as in literally today. I mean these days. AI. AI poses great opportunities for some companies, and it poses existential threats for some companies. And an example of something the board should be thinking about, if it's among those companies, if it's in an industry where it's hard to imagine most industries, most companies that don't have the potential to be impacted positively or negatively, or perhaps both, by AI. But perhaps it's not a today thing, it's not a next week thing, it's not even a next year thing, because the nature of the business is such that it's just, it's easy to understand that everybody can agree that it's not going to impact the business during this fiscal quarter or this fiscal year. But long term, there seems to be, everybody understands there's some real risk or some real opportunity. And that's a good, I think, example of something the board might spend a lot more time thinking about than the C-suite, at least until the calendar progresses. Does anyone want to overlay on that?
So I'll add one thought for people who are directors or aspire to be directors, John. I thought you brought out an excellent point. I participated on two. One was an article I wrote, and one was a podcast. And for directors, I suggested there's a couple ways to do exactly what you just said, which is to move up the curve in knowledge. And I'll describe them in three scenarios. On one extreme is to do it all yourself. Highly unlikely. If Microsoft couldn't do it all by themselves, it's not likely your company can. And on the other extreme is to totally outsource that knowledge, that education, that partnership, that implementation. And I would say that's not such a wise strategy either, because all the learning is going to be domiciled somewhere else. So a middle ground in becoming conversant and then participants is what I advocate. And there's lots of different ways to do that in the middle ground. One way that I advocated is to possibly consider partnering with a VC firm in some way, whether it's knowledge sharing or whether it's investment or whether it's just advisory board, because it's so sprawling and so fast moving and so, I would argue, impactful and so lucrative and so dangerous that there's many different ways, but your point about calling it out, I think, is extremely germane.
Thank you. I'll note that today is the live premiere of this webinar is today, February 4th, 2025. In 2 days, Financial Poise and the National Law Review will be conducting or premiering a webinar that's part of their corporate risk management series. And the title of that is Remembering HAL 9000, Thinking About the Risks in Artificial Intelligence to an Enterprise. So that's timely. And if you're watching this on demand, that webinar, like this webinar, is available on demand.
And not to put a fine point on it, John, HAL 9000, in case any of our audience members don't recall, HAL 9000 went haywire and was intent on killing the humans. And I think that's a premonition that needs to be thought about and strenuously worked to avoid.
So
You may want to just,
I'm going to make one comment and put in a plug. I think Alan is making an excellent point. And I work a lot in the governance of AI. And the plug I'm going to put in is I'm actually on that panel Thursday, so I encourage everybody to attend. But one of the things I talk about is when you look at the safety and security of AI, we seem to have learned from our history where we are trying to get ahead of it, where in the past we've been playing catch up. And those movies, there's a lot of them, including the Terminator movies, seem to have raised the level of awareness and the level of concern, which is actually having a very positive effect across the board where people are mindful of it. You know, the thing that Alan was saying is about you need to get in front of this. The mindset seems to be there from some of these dystopic movies.
and the other point, just I'm sorry, Ellen, but the other point is just a famous quote. I can never remember whose this is. All this is leading to the notion of the quote was, "Those who don't study history are doomed to repeat it."
Yeah.
Mark Twain, didn't Mark Twain said history doesn't always repeat itself, but it often rhymes?
I think it was George Santayana, David, but just to double down on Alex's point, imagine if people in their basement were working on nuclear energy and nuclear bombs. AI, as we are starting to understand, has that potential destructive impact. And it can bring good, curing cancer. But anyway, boards should be conversant however they wish to be. Back to you, John.
The only thing I'll add to that is when Jonathan brought up AI, I don't think he realized he was going to lose control of this session.
So,
our intelligence isn't artificial, guys, just to be clear.
There we go. There we go.
however, I was able to spot check in the time you guys are talking. I asked my chat GPT on my phone who penned or the coined the phrase "those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it," which by the way is inaccurate. I typed it wrong, right? It's not even
Uh-huh.
a good way to type it.
Who was it?
But notice, yeah, it was George Santayana, as Alan said,
Alan wins.
a Spanish American philosopher, writer, and poet. Amazing, particularly since I asked the question in a bad way. Anywho, so look, we're 2/3 of the way done with this episode of this series, and I wanted to take a moment to point out two things. I guess this counts as a little bit of an infomercial, but it's for you, audience. It's for you. It's not about us. It's about you. Slide 8, which I have displayed now, shows the premiere dates, the live premiere dates of the other 3 episodes in this webinar series. And then slides 57 through 64. As you can imagine, as maybe you've gathered, this topic is a weighty topic. And so there is a webinar series consisting of 22 and a half hours of content spread over 90-minute webinars, co-produced by by Financial Poise, the Private Directors Association, Executive Forum, Private Director Symposium, and Chamberwise, that each of the panelists and I had involvement in. But if you're looking at my screen, you can see each episode features a different set of experts based on the subject matter of that particular webinar episode. And I commend it to everybody's attention who really wants to take a very deep dive into the topic of sort of all things board of directors and all things fiduciary duties. It's hard to find a collection like this, and it's actually extraordinary value. They're $30 an episode or $300 for all of them. So I just wanted to call that out to you. And should you download the slide deck for this webinar, all of the hyperlinks are clickable and you can click or you can search. Anyway, back to the program. And here's a sort of a broad question I will direct to David. David, what else should a board be talking about that we haven't discussed, and what should a board not be talking about?
Well, let me start off by saying, excuse me, I am not a lawyer, but the answer to this question is it depends. Because it very much is,
That's not nice.
Well, no,
That's
but
perfect.
I will tell you,
That's
I've spent a
perfect.
lot of time with lawyers, and that statement is one that comes out of their mouths often. And
Yeah. Who's dating who? It
but
doesn't
for
matter unless it's the CEO dating his general counsel.
there you go. But anyway, so the starting answer, and then what is it that the charter calls out, and what is it that the charter asks for the board to do, and then who is it in the hierarchy that can ask the board to do things? Is it just the CEO? Is it just the board chair? Are there other issues that come up that, for example, if somebody on the board is a CPA with experience in X, then, is it clear that that's what the CFO should be going through? I've worked with a number of boards where, excuse me, the board has been primarily a domestic operation, or the company has been primarily a domestic operation, and a number of members of the board have extensive experience in international work. And so asking about the kinds of issues that they need to face, and understanding that, again, I spent a lot of time when I was working for Motorola many years setting up companies outside the United States and understanding, and it was a aha moment to understand that our laws were different than theirs in terms of how companies were set up. And please understand, this was back in the 90s and early 2000s. And so we didn't have quite the access to the internet that we have today in understanding these things. So it is being there to help, again, look out over the horizon on specific issues. The stuff that they shouldn't be doing, that the board shouldn't be doing typically is, and we've talked a little bit about this already, they're not there to talk about tactics. They're not there to talk about specific operational things. But occasionally, there will be a point where, because of their expertise, I ran a post-industrial plastic recycling business for a while. And I ran a post-industrial plastic recycling business that, when our banks got taken over, the new bank didn't like the business, so ended up being able to close us down. So I can answer a lot of questions about what do you do to avoid that kind of issue. And sometimes I get asked to really dive deeply in it. And I'm moving from being a board member to being a consultant. And what you need to do as a board member is to be able to draw that line in your head of, what am I doing? And you need to be able to say to the chair, and there may be times when you can't do this, but to say, look, what you're asking me is something that, yes, I have the expertise in, but if you're asking me to get involved and engaged in something, you're asking me to be a consultant rather than a board member. And either sometimes the board may not allow me to be a consultant, so let me refer you to other people. Sometimes it may allow me to be a consultant, but if I'm going to be a consultant, I have to recuse myself from duties relating to this issue as a board member. And so there's all kinds of, ins and outs of this whole discussion of what, what can the board do, what can't the board do, what can the board members do, and what can't they do.
Yeah, I'd like to highlight a couple of things in what David just walked through, because I think they're incredibly important. First and foremost, the board has to do what only the board can do, because if they don't do it, it won't get done.
Right.
Right. So absolutely need to do that. Second, let the officers of the companies do what they need to do, because that's their job, that's their expertise. And if they're not capable of doing it, you should relook at the decisions that were made that got you there. Then lastly, there are situations, and unfortunately I've seen them and I've experienced them, where management or the officers of the company are not performing, and the board does need to get into their knickers because it's in the best interest of the company. Those situations should be few, very, very few, and very, very far between. But you need to recognize that there are some times where you have to break glass and do what you're not supposed to do because you're the only one around that can do it. Doesn't mean that's the way it should be forever. You should backfill with external expertise or relook at your staffing plan. But there might be some very limited times where, for some short windows, board members, because of their expertise and their backgrounds, will need to jump in.
Thank you. We're now entering our speed round with about 10 minutes remaining. So I'm going to ask you guys to respond in the first instance, trying to keep your response down to about 60 seconds or less. With that ground rule, Alex, one saying we often hear in the context of a board of directors is noses in, fingers out. What does that mean?
Exactly what we just talked about and David was talking about. The board has some very strategic activities that only the board can do. You should do it. You need to remain aware and be cognizant of everything going on in the organization and have the experience and sort out the right information so you can make informed decisions, which is one of your required duties.
David, next audience, turn to slide 35 if you're able to. In some cases, David, a board of directors may not be the only governance structure the organization has. In particular, and we sort of touched on this before, in a family-owned business, there may be family governance, like a family council, particularly in very successful businesses with wealthy families. and multi-generational families, right? Family-owned businesses. And family council might make decisions and represent the interests of the family. How does a board of directors fit in with a structure like that?
It starts with, and we've talked about this at length, I think,
Yep.
is just what's the charter and what do the bylaws say? And very often in the example that you've given where there's a family council or a family business office or whatever that's involved, they will have responsibility. They may have responsibility for certain things. The other part is they may also have responsibility for electing a number of the directors. And so it's understanding what, this is our responsibilities according to the charter. This is their responsibilities according to the charter, and acting appropriately.
That's right. Thank you. Overlay, anyone? Quick. Next question. Alan, tell us, audience, talk to us a little bit about the what's the difference between first an inside versus an outside director? And then what is an independent director?
Okay, but before we do that, I know this is the Tighten Up round. I'm going to give you a chance to see who did the Tighten Up song. I think it was Archie Bell and the Drells from the 60s, but I'm going to keep going. So the reason to have independent directors bring different thinking. They bring different relationships.
Well, what
They
are
bring,
they? First, define it.
Oh, an independent director is one whose financial wherewithal is not dependent on the company. And so, who would that be? It wouldn't be employees, they're not independent. It wouldn't be spouses or deep family members. It wouldn't be vendors who have deep relationships. It wouldn't be consultants who have deep relationships. It would not be any of those. None of those would be considered as independent. It can be people who have a consulting relationship, but for SEC purposes, it generally needs to be de minimis below a certain level. And I've been in those situations. So independent directors, those whose financial wherewithal is not dependent on the company, employed by the company, or get significant resources from the company. And the reason to have them is, as I enumerated, they bring a difference of a perspective, they bring different relationships, and importantly, they can make certain that the inside directors are not self-dealing to the detriment of all the shareholders.
Overlay, anyone?
That last piece is very important. About
That's right.
self-healing. That's a very important job of the board, and we could spend a lot of time in, what governance structures do you put in place for that? But we don't have the time.
Yeah, and it's a theme we'll explore in future episodes. So audience, slides 41 through 44 sort of speak to why have independent directors, and also why mix it up, and even if it's not an independent director, why have new directors? What the value of not having the same director in place forever and ever. Slide 45 touches on how to attract new independent directors, and slides 21 through 22, I'm not displaying them, give some insight into what shareholders look for in director candidates. And slides 25 through 29 speak to what does it take to be a successful board member. So if in particular you're in the audience and you're thinking about trying to become a board member, or you've been asked to be a board member, slides 25 through 29 may be of interest to you. David, next question is to you. What about managing activities of the board itself? One that comes to my mind is the need to balance sort of transparency with confidentiality. How should a board think about what to share, when, with whom? Talk to us about that.
This goes back to understanding what the charter and the bylaws say about who information is shared with. Because this kind of question comes up, if a vice president walks into the room, just happens in, or if you have dinner with the vice president, you know, you have dinner with what often happens is the board meets with the leadership of the company. What do you talk about with them as opposed to, you know, that you're allowed to talk about with them? And so it's understanding what those rules are, what the board's rules are in terms of what their charters say. If there's an ethics issue, it comes up very much of what's the process? Is there a process? And for a lot of this, it's making sure that what are the processes, you know, that you have, you not only have talked about them, but you've written down what are the processes for dealing with, well, there's a question of ethics, there's a question with financials, there's a question with X, Y, or Z. How do you deal with those issues? That's the question that the board needs to understand. And each one of those, and who can you talk to about these things when they come up?
Thank you. Overlay anyone? Alex, audience, slide 17. Talk to us a little bit more about conflicts of interest. What kind, give us a couple of examples maybe of the
Okay.
sort of issue that might arise,
All right.
and how to address them.
So there's really two broad categories, right? There's the legal requirements, like we talked about the duties before, and independence. Then there's also the perception issues, right? The general rule with conflicts of interest is, and sit down with your attorney and go over this, because there's definitely some legal basis for this that needs to be addressed. It could be incorporated in your documents, like David was mentioning. It could be in a lot of other places, and that needs to be looked at. But the general rule is, if it looks suspicious, we use that word for a second, to an objective, informed third party, it's not a good idea. It's that simple. Now, what does that mean? For example, if the company decides to change suppliers to a new steel manufacturer, and you happen on be on the board, but you're also the CEO of that steel manufacturer you're going to, you probably don't want to be part of the selection committee. You probably want to recuse yourself because it looks suspicious. It just looks suspicious. It's that simple. Just like we hear of politicians who make major decisions that were friendly to a certain company, and we find out their spouses like own stock in them, or did a trade just days before. It looks suspicious. It may be totally innocent. It can be, but it just looks suspicious, and it causes a lot of angst and a lot of loss of trust. It may not disable trust, but it'll definitely start to tarnish it. And this stuff tends to erode over time, so you want to avoid it. There's a lot of other common examples that we've all seen. Another one would be, and I dealt with this. A board member's granddaughter was hired by a company, right? So all of a sudden it became, well, she wasn't hired because she was the best candidate. Instead, they did it because they're a board member. All right. So you have to manage that process. And a lot of this comes down to just managing the process. So be in the spirit of full disclosure, disclose it to the board, talk to all the right people, the CEO, legal, HR, and work through it. Worst case, you may have to recuse yourself.
Thank you. We're gonna have to end in just a moment. We're out of time, but we're gonna begin the next episode on March 4th. We're gonna pick up right where we left off here, and we're gonna talk about how to tie in the practical advice we just heard from Alex with we're gonna connect it to the very specific the relevant legal doctrines. And just as a quick preview, the judgment, the duty of care and the duty of loyalty, if they're satisfied, and a way to make sure they're not satisfied is to have someone who has a conflict of interest be part of a decision. But if they are satisfied, then the board is entitled to quote unquote the business judgment rule, which is a highly protective rule of law derived by case law that says, look, if the board abides by, satisfies the duty of loyalty and the duty of care, the board is allowed to make mistakes, and a director is not going to be sued. At least the director is not going to be sued and will lose if the director followed those two rules, satisfied them. And that's not enough on that topic, and that's why we're going to begin there on the same on the next bat episode of this bat series, if you get my reference. Panel, thank you for your participation. Look forward to working with you and then on the next one in a month. Audience, we all hope you got something or some things valuable out of this and that it wasn't too painful for CLE. This webinar is concluded. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.